Ladies and gentlemen, purveyors of reason and adherents to the sacred principles of enlightenment, I must regrettably address an intellectual travesty masquerading as a podcast, one that features the notoriously prolix Dr. Jordan Peterson and his sycophantic accomplice, Dr. Eric Peter Kaufmann. What we have before us is an execrable exercise in pseudo-intellectualism, a frothing cesspool of logical fallacies smeared with the veneer of academic rigor. This podcast purports to dissect cultural indoctrination, but instead serves as a flagrant exhibition of how two men can speak at length and say nothing of substance. Let us begin with the audible cacophony of straw men that litter this verbal battlefield. Dr. Peterson and Dr. Kaufmann construct grotesque caricatures of their ideological foes, transforming complex socio-political discourses into easily vanquishable spectres of radical leftism and progressive literalism. They would have us believe that the hallowed halls of academia are nothing more than breeding grounds for Marxist revolutionaries poised to dismantle Western civilization. Such grotesque hyperbole would be laughable were it not so dangerously detached from reality. Employing broad generalizations, they conflate the diverse spectrum of progressive thought into a monolithic entity hell-bent on cultural annihilation. This is intellectual indolence at its most pernicious, an affront to the nuanced discourse that intellectually honest individuals strive to maintain. Next, let us turn our attention to the grievous slippery slope fallacies strewn throughout their diatribe. According to our illustrious hosts, the acceptance of progressive ideas in education is a gateway to the collapse of all societal structures. One might think that acknowledging the value of diversity or gender studies would lead inexorably to the downfall of democratic norms and institutions. This is the rankest form of alarmist rhetoric, designed not to foster understanding, but to stoke hysterical fears among the ill-informed. It is the epistemological equivalent of shouting, "Fire!" in a crowded theatre when someone lights a match. The dialogue is similarly saturated with false dichotomies, presenting the world in terms of stark, simplistic binaries. In the fevered imaginations of Peterson and Kaufmann, one must either be a stalwart defender of Western tradition or a slavish devotee of postmodern deconstructionism. There is no room for complexity, no acknowledgement that individuals might hold diverse beliefs without subscribing to extreme narratives. This intellectual reductionism is not just misleading. It is a deliberate obfuscation that poisons the well of public discourse. Perhaps the most egregious sin is the shameless appeal to fear and emotion. Peterson and Kaufmann weave a tale of cultural power shifts and lost civilization, painting young women as helpless victims manipulated by the nefarious forces of compassionate femininity. One cannot help but notice the thinly veiled misogyny that permeates these assertions. Women, it would seem, are portrayed as inherently gullible, incapable of rational thought, and destined to be led astray by the pink-haired Pied Pipers of progressivism. Such unfounded claims not only betray a deep-seated distrust of half the human race, but also insult the intelligence of any reasonable listener. Begging the question, another cardinal sin of logical reasoning is perpetrated with abandon. The entire discourse is predicated on the assumption that progressive education is inherently malevolent and destructive. This dubious premise is never questioned nor substantiated with empirical evidence. Instead, it serves as the shaky foundation upon which all subsequent arguments are constructed. Indeed, if one were to remove this circular reasoning from their dialogue, the entire edifice of their argument would collapse like a house of cards. Adding to this intellectual miasma are numerous red herrings, wherein the conversation diverges into tangential anecdotes and irrelevant historical comparisons. We are regaled with apocryphal tales of the Black Panthers and the supposed erosion of free speech, all designed to distract from the glaring lack of coherent evidence supporting their primary thesis. This tactic is not only intellectually dishonest, but also a blatant attempt to bamboozle the audience with a smokescreen of erudition. Let us not overlook the grotesque moral panic and hyperbole that underpin their entire dialogue. Peterson and Kaufmann's rhetoric is suffused with a sense of impending doom, as if the very fabric of reality is under siege by cancel culture and academic radicalism. They conjure a dystopian vision of society wherein the slightest political incorrectness is met with public evisceration and professional ruin. This overwrought narrative serves not to inform but to inflame, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and baseless fear. Guilt by association is another insidious tactic employed with gleeful abandon. In this intellectual kangaroo court, any individual or idea remotely associated with progressive thought is condemned without trial. Legitimate social justice concerns are thus dismissed out of hand, tainted by proximity to the radical elements Peterson and Kaufman so eagerly vilify. This sweeping condemnation is not only unjust, but also intellectually lazy, failing to engage with the merits of individual arguments. Perhaps most troubling is the profound hypocrisy that pervades the podcast. While decrying the so-called indoctrination of youth, Peterson and Kaufman seem wholly untroubled by their own ideological dogmatism. They pontificate at length about the necessity of free speech and open debate, yet their own discourse is a rigid echo chamber, intolerant of dissenting viewpoints. Their relentless critique of the left's supposed obsession with power ignores their own transparent attempts to consolidate ideological hegemony. The dialogue between Dr. Jordan Peterson and Dr. Eric Peter Kaufman is a fetid morass of logical fallacies, rhetorical chicanery, and intellectual bad faith. It is a masterclass in how not to engage in reasoned discourse, serving only to reinforce pre-existing biases and sow division. If we are to advance the cause of human understanding, we must reject such noxious sophistry and commit ourselves to the relentless pursuit of truth, however uncomfortable it may be.